Before we start building this app, let's globally install nodemon, which will automatically restart and reload our app as we keep writing and saving out our code, so we don't have to do it. To install nodemon, simply type npm install-g nodemon. Once installed, you can simply run your app by typing nodemon space app.js instead of the usual node space app.js, and nodemon will start your app and watch for any changes made from here on. Now, the moment you make a change and save, you can see nodemon automatically restarts your app. Okay, back to our project. Now, as discussed previously, we will create a plugin called Core, which will contain all the functionality that we need for routes and logic. So begin by creating a folder called Core, and within that create an index.js file. You can name the file anything you like, but if you choose to call it index.js, you can load it in by just referring to the folder in your require statements. This is much like a standard web server that is able to load an index.html file by just referring to the directory that contains it. We'll enable the strict mode first as we did previously, and let's scaffold out our core plugin by creating a function called core that accepts the server argument that lets us access the global server instance and its methods, an options variable that lets us insert custom data into this plugin, and a call to next to enable Happy to finish registering this plugin into the server instance. We will also provide a name to this plugin by registering this as an attribute like so. There are other attributes that you can register here, like version and a parameter called multiple that tells Happy that it is safe to register this plugin more than once. However, we don't need either, so I'll just skip those. Finally, we'll use module.exports to export this as a standard module. Next, within the core folder, let's also create another folder called routes and place another index.js file like so. This is where we'll define all our routes. However, it will not be a standard Happy plugin. But instead, a simple function that returns back an array where we can place our objects that define routes. So begin by moving the hello happy route to this file by cutting it from the app.js and pasting it inside this array. I'll also move the server.route method from the app.js to the core plugin like so. And inside the server.route method, let's just bring in the routes array by using the require statement to point to the routes folder and invoking it like a function because we're indeed returning a function from the routes file. Notice I'm not specifically mentioning the index.js since it will be loaded in by default. Finally, at the end of this, we'll return the next callback to enable Happy to finish registering this plugin. You can just invoke the next callback as is without the return keyword, and that would work too. However, to end this function, I'll prefer to use the standard return statement. So once again, we have loaded routes inside the core plugin by separating them out into a module, and this is where we'll code the business logic for this plugin. Now that we've defined this plugin, we need to mount and register it into the main server instance. To do that, in your app.js, use the server.register method where the first argument will be an array where we can register multiple plugins, followed by an anonymous function which takes in an error argument. Once again, we are using the ES6 arrow function notation here. Inside this function, we'll check for any errors, and if so, console.log them out. And if not, we would want to start serving this app. And for this purpose, we'll just move the server.start method here like so. Now every plugin needs to be registered through an object that would go inside this array. So we'll create an object and use the register parameter to bring in the core plugin we just created by requiring it in like so. Again, I'm simply pointing to the folder since our plugin's script file is called index.js. And that is all you need to register a plugin into the Happy server instance. Reloading the browser confirms that our app is working as expected. But we don't want to serve Hello Happy here, but rather this HTML file which forms the UI for this app. To do this, we'll have to serve this HTML file from within our route handler. But first, we'll have to equip Happy with the skills to serve static assets like CSS files, for instance. For this purpose, the makers of Happy have a plugin called inert that we'll use. So on the prompt, type npm install inert @3.0.1 /save to download the inert module. Now in the app.js within the server.register methods plugin array, create an object and use the register property to bring in the inert plugin like so. Another original Happy plugin that we need is Vision, which lets us use a templating language like handlebars to render the HTML file as a template with custom data inserted in at the time of rendering. So let's first install Vision by typing npm install vision @3.0.0 /save, and once it's done, let's also install the handlebars templating language module like so. I'm using version 3.0.3 of the handlebars module in this project. Once all these modules are installed, let's register the Vision plugin first, just like how we registered the inert plugin and our own core plugin. Alright, now that we have inert and Vision loaded in, we'll configure Happy to use the handlebars templating language to render HTML files. This can be done by the server.views method which Vision brings into the server instance. Create an object where the first parameter would be engines, which again takes an object where we'll set HTML property to bring in the handlebars module like so. This sets Vision to use the handlebars language whenever it has to render a file with the extension .html. The second property that we'll set here is path, which tells Happy where to find these HTML files, and we'll use Node's built-in path module for this purpose. Path.join here is being used to create a path by combining the current directory and a reference to the views folder which sits at the root of the Node folder which contains this app. The path.join smartly joins these two to point straight to the views folder, and this is where Happy looks for the HTML files when it has to render a view. And since we are using Node's path module, let's bring it in by using a constant reference called path and using the require statement to bring path in. Now, though I'm bringing the handlebars plugin directly inside the plugin's function declaration, you can bring it in outside of the function declaration like how the path module is being brought in. If there are a lot of modules being loaded into a plugin, then keeping your require statements outside the function declaration is advised and considered more efficient. Now to serve our index.html file, I'll go into the routes file and let's comment out the reply statement, and instead we'll use the reply.view interface where the first argument is the name of the view file, which in this case is index.html. Note that we don't need to type in the .html extension, as that is implied when the views handler looks inside the views folder using the handlebars engine to render HTML files. The second argument is an object which can be used to pass data that can be rendered statically by Happy within the index.html page while serving. For now, we'll just keep this as blank. Now go back in the browser and hit refresh, and you can see the HTML page, but it seems to have lost its style sheet. Let's fix that by creating a route that serves static assets from the public folder. To do this, add another object to the routes array like so, and as before, set the HTTP method to get first, followed by path, which in this case would be set to /public/ curly brackets param asterisk. Next, the handler in this case is an object that defines the directory within which to look for the files being requested, and we'll set that as the public folder. The path here is from the app's root, and hence it finds the public folder easily. Now let me rewind a few seconds and clarify the path parameter here. What we're saying with this statement is that when someone requests a path that begins with /public, first capture the second part of that statement, which is where the actual reference to the requested folder or file would be. This is done by the curly brackets param asterisk wildcard expression, which uses the asterisk to capture references to files or folders up to any level deep. Some examples of the kind of file paths that this wildcard notation can resolve look like this. Here, the /public/ can be removed as well, since the path notation here can be built up in any way we like. The actual resolution of file paths is done by whatever is captured in the param asterisk expression and using the reference to the public folder as registered in the handler for this path. Any prefix to the wildcard expression in the path property is purely optional and customizable. There are other wildcards available, such as a question mark, which limits the directory traversal to one folder deep only. Now open the index.html file from the views folder, and let's change our relative and static reference to the CSS file to how Happy will serve. This is easily done by removing the leading double dots here. As you can notice, /public/ CSS /style.css will be automatically resolved out of the public directory using the route we just defined. Doing this job is the inert plugin which we registered a while back. Refresh the browser and you can see that our page now correctly loads up the style sheet. Do keep in mind that if you're using Nginx, you can use that instead to serve static assets as shown in the previous section. That way, Happy can avoid serving static assets and is categorically a better deal in a high-performance production environment. Finally, I will bring in our studentdata.json file, and we would like our process button here to accurately display the number of records from that file. Now, I can bring in the file within the core plugin itself. However, I'll bring it in at the root in the app.js because I want to demonstrate the options parameter, which can be used while registering plugins. So in the app.js, bring in the studentdata.json file from the data folder that sits outside of the node folder like so. In reality, instead of a JSON file, this data could be coming in from any resource, such as a MongoDB database. Next, within the object that registers our core plugin, create an options property within which we'll create a custom variable, and I'll call it data, and this would refer to the dataset that we brought in. In fact, let's get rid of the const statement and directly place the require statement inside the options property like so. This will inject the contents of the studentdata.json file into the core plugin, where it will be available via the options variable for us to consume. So now back in the core plugin file, we'll pass the options object to the routes function as an argument like so, since unlike the server which is global, the options has to be specifically passed in for the route definitions to use. And finally, in the routes module, we will create a variable called record count, which will be set to the options.data.length. Since options.data refers to the array of data that is brought in from the student data.json file, the .length property will simply provide us with the number of records in that array, which we are injecting into the index.html view via the record count variable. Finally, in the index.html view file, find the anchor tag for the process cards button and replace the text 100 with a reference to the record count property using the handlebars double curly bracket notation. And that's it. Refresh the page and there you go. The button now displays 289 records, which is precisely the number of records I have in the JSON file. There is a lot that we have done here, so I would recommend going back and re-watching this video to pause and code along. If there is anything that you feel has not been explained too well, feel free to ask about it in the forum and I'll be happy to assist as always.